This is question number 1 on homework 12 for module 15. So this is a very typical valuation problem using multiples. Here we have two kinds of multiples, price to NOA multiple and price to book multiple. So price to book basically is the market value of the equity to the book value of the equity. That's what the PB ratio is defined. So we're provided with a bunch of numbers, and for the three companies, Target, Kohl's, and Walmart. The question A is compute the price to net operating assets ratio for both Kohl's and Walmart. So one thing we need to pay attention to using the market multiples is that if the performance measure, in this case, the performance measure is the net operating assets, is company related, then we also need to use the company value as the numerator. But if the performance measure is only the equity related, which is what the PB ratio is about, then we need to use the market value of the equity as the numerator. So you can find that note from my lecture slides or from the book. Basically, so that's what these two green arrows are about. If an equity performance measure is selected, then output will be an equity value. But if a company performance measure is selected, then output will be a company value. So company performance measures include measures such as NOPAT and NOA. So in our case, it's NOA. And equity performance measures include earnings or book value. In our case, it's the book value. And what's different about these two is that if we use the company performance measure, then after we calculate the market multiples based on the comparable firms. So in our case, the two comparable firms to target is Kohl's and Walmart. Then we can bring that the average those two of the market multiples of the comparable firms and bring that over to our firm, which we try to estimate the value. Then we can get the market value of the company. But after that, we also need to deduct the N&O from the net non-operating obligations from the company value to figure out the market value of the equity. So let me first copy this table to my Excel sheet to facilitate the calculation. All right, copy this special by text, and then you can see we have the numbers on our Excel sheet. So the first part of the question is compute the price to net operating assets. Basically, price to net operating assets is not very precise. We should use the intrinsic value of the company or the assumed company value. I think that's what this is called, company assumed value divided by the net operating assets. So we first calculate these two ratios for the two comparable firms. So that's going to be company value divided by NOA. So this is company assumed value for Kohl's divided by NOA for Kohl's. And then we need to pay attention to the rounding requirement. In this case, it says round your answers to the 2 decimal places. So as I repeatedly mentioned, I think I recommend you to use the round function in Excel because many times MBC will use the rounded values for subsequent calculations. And using the round functions, we will take care of that requirement. And then once I calculated the company value to NOA multiple of cost, I can just drag the cell to the other column, and Excel will automatically calculate the similar value to Walmart. So we're basically done with the first part of this question. Just copy the number. So just copy the number for Kohl's and copy the number for Walmart. And then the part B is basically asks us to use these two companies as comparables and estimate the intrinsic value of the equity for target. And again, pay attention to the rounding requirement. Round the intrinsic value and equity intrinsic value to the nearest median and the value per share to the nearest cent. So nearest cent means that we need to keep two decimal places because the units here are in dollars or in yes, normally it's in dollars. So first part is average of the two rounded ratios to in and above, round to the two decimal places. So this part is relatively ratio. So we just take the average of that, of these two numbers. Again, I can use a round function, round this to two decimal places as required. Even though in this case, actually, I don't need because even without rounding, the average of these two numbers is precisely this 2.94. So you can just copy this number back here and use a rounded answer above to calculate the following company intrinsic value. So in this case, company intrinsic value, we can just copy the calculate this to be, and now I can bring this over this ratio because the assumption here is that we can use the comparable firms market multiple and use that as to be our own firm's market multiple. And then because this market multiple is defined to be company value divided by NOA, so to figure out the company value of our own firm, in this case Target, and then we just need to multiply this average of these two comparable firms market multiples and then by the NOA of our own firm. So I just multiply this 2.94 and then the net operating assets of our own firm. And then pay attention to the rounding requirement, round intrinsic value to the nearest median. So the units here should already in medians. So we just round this to RON and this to 0 decimal place. All right, so just copy that number back. And then the equity intrinsic value, I can just, as I said, company assumed value is simply equity assumed value, which is the intrinsic value, and then plus the NNO. So to figure out equity assumed value, I just need to use the company assumed value and then subtract the NNO, the net operating obligations of our firm. So that's basically the equity assumed value. So, and then copy that number back. And equity intrinsic value per share this is simply the equity assumed value and then divided by the common shares outstanding. And before I do that, I do want to get rid of the shares because Excel won't accept, won't recognize the words here. I just want to keep the number. So equals equity assumed value, and then divided by the common shares outstanding. And then remember, as we said, this needs to keep 2 decimal places because it asks us to round to the nearest cent. So this is the estimated intrinsic value per share of the equity. So C, compute the PB ratio for both Kohl's and Walmart. So the second part of this problem is using the PB ratio to do similar calculations. But as we noted earlier, because PB ratio, the denominator here is the equity performance measure. So we don't actually compare with the first ratio, the first market multiple. We don't have to subtract the N and O once we get the market value of the equity. We can simply use the market value of the equity after we bring the average market multiples from the comparable firms to our own firm, and then we use that and figure out the market value of the equity, and then we divide it by the number of shares outstanding to figure out the intrinsic value per share. So let's start. The PB ratio for the two comparable firms is simply the market value of the equity for Kohl's and then divided by the book value of the equity. So for this, I think we also need to keep 2 decimal places. So let me double check. Yes, and then drag the cell to the other company, and Excel will automatically calculate that for me. So just copy the number back, and then similarly, I just take the average ratio. This is simply the average of these two numbers. In this case, I do need to use the round function because you can see that without round, we actually will have 3 decimal places. So this will give me 3.52, and then copy that number back and use the rounded average calculated above to calculate the following: equity intrinsic value. So now I can just directly bring this ratio back to our own firm target. So equity intrinsic value will be this ratio because this is PB for our own firm. PB is the market value of the equity divided by the book value of the equity. So now if I want to figure out the market value of the equity, which is the equity value here, I just need to multiply this ratio by the book value of the equity of our own firm. But again, we need to round to the nearest dollar by keeping 0 decimal places. And this is 2 decimal place because the format here, I just kept 2 decimal places. So I just need to copy that number back, and then equity value per share is simply this value, equity value, this is the aggregate, divided by the number of shares outstanding. Again, use the round function to keep only 2 decimal places and copy that number back. And you can see that it's very typical that using these two methods actually gives us different estimates, right? Using the NOA multiple gives us an estimate of the equity value per share of $74.92, but using the PB ratio actually gives us an estimate of $63.99, and that's very common actually. So now let's check whether we got the correct answers. All right, so I guess we got 11 points out of 11.